Thank you, Mr Deputy Chair, and it's with pleasure that I rise to speak on this bill in the House tonight. It's a pleasure only in the sense that my comments come from a place of concern about the legislation being put before the House this evening, and concern that is based upon both evidence that has come before respective committees of this parliament, but also the experiences of Indigenous men and women who have talked to me about the implications of this proposal in their communities and concerns around the expansion of such proposed trials into new communities. Mr Deputy Speaker, of course, this bill before us is in fact the Social Security's Legislation Amendment Cashless Debit Card Bill of 2017. And in this bill, in essence, this bill is seeking to remove section 124PF of the Social Security Act, which is the one that currently provides for the trial sites for the cashless debit cards in 3 discrete locations, puts a cap on there being no more than 10,000 participants, and in fact expires on the 30th of June this year. I guess the bill seeks to allow for, it seeks to make this amendment to allow for these both the continuation in the existing sites and potential expansion of the cashless debit card into further new locations, but regretfully does so on the basis of, at best, very flimsy evidence. And that is a real problem for us as lawmakers and policymakers, where we do not have substantive evidence before us to be able to say, these measures are meeting the delivered outcomes, that there were clear purposes set down for the cashless debit card, and there have been terrific measured outcomes, and that you could see the genuine social, cultural and economic sort of advantages of this cashless debit card. But we don't have any of that before us, and so I have, like my Labor colleagues who are speaking to this bill today, have grave concerns about a number of aspects in this bill. I am deeply concerned about the non-voluntary nature of the measures in this bill. I am also deeply concerned about the clearly disproportionate impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and those who don't have drug, alcohol or gambling concerns, of which in these communities there are, of course, many, many. But this sort of, throw a big wide net, capture everybody in a community under this one sort of very blunt instrument, the cashless debit card, that kind of approach sweeps up everybody, and in doing so completely disempowers so many people in those communities. I could not even begin to imagine what it would be like to have, spent my life, trying to determine the futures of myself and my own families, to be an autonomous human being, to be a great contributor to my community, perhaps being a leader in that community, having to now forego all of that autonomy because the government prefers to cast the wide net and throw, one very blunt instrument at what is a very deep historical, social and economic challenge in many of our communities. To me, Mr Deputy Speaker, that is the essence of lazy policy making. That is an example of a government that has such short-term thinking, that has such a narrow focus on the situation before them. It is indicative of a gross lack of vision. It's indicative of the complete lack of ambition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia. Mr Deputy Speaker, in a few days this House is going to have the Close the Gap report before us again. Without preempting that report, I expect that, like years beforehand, that report is going to let down Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia gravely. Every one of us in this House should be deeply ashamed by the continued lack of process. I am hopeful that we might see some progress around some of the education indicators in Close the Gap. I am hopeful we might see some movement towards both secondary and higher education achievements for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in this country. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think we are all dreading that report, in the sense that there will be continued failures of government policy to have the desired impact and outcomes. You would think that the Australian Parliament might learn from these mistakes that we face year after year after year. You might think that those of us in this place may think, well, we're not getting it right when we simply seek to impose policy solutions in these communities. We've got any number of reports and examples to show that this is a pathway to failure. Yet, here we have before us another piece of legislation that I would argue does exactly that. Exactly what we know doesn't work. So, where is the plan for jobs in remote and regional Australia? Where are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people going to be getting their jobs, participating in mainstream economic activity, earning a livelihood to increase their quality of lives, and to have a decent income? There aren't any plans for that on the table. Where are those plans that are going to improve Indigenous health and well-being in Australia? For goodness sake, this government can't even commit to a housing agreement across the states and territories in Australia. Right now there are communities screaming out everywhere for safe, affordable housing options in their communities. We know that housing is one of those social determinants for quality health and well-being in our communities. But no, we've got no answer for jobs and employment for these communities that are crying out for some kind of support mechanisms. We've got no investment into important infrastructure like housing into these communities. We've got no sort of additional wraparound or adequately funded and long-term wraparound services that would assist people seeking to rehabilitation around alcohol, drugs and gambling addictions. That's not part of the government's thinking. That's not part of the plan here. No, and that is why I call this policy out as lazy policy. We see it far too often in this House, and nowhere is it made more clear than policies directed into First Nation peoples. Each and every time this government says, you know, frankly, we don't know what to do, we're going to, we're going to throw this one out there and see how that goes. But don't worry, it'll just be a temporary measure. It's a bit of time out for these communities who are facing, I don't underestimate for one moment, Deputy Speaker, for the challenges that a number of these communities are facing, and people absolutely are crying out for support and help around those drug, alcohol and gambling addictions that are troubling not just to those individuals but to entire families and networks within communities. Don't underestimate that for one moment. But as I said, what is required in those situations are community-driven solutions. Community-driven solutions that are then supported by us in this House, supported both financially and indeed the other sorts of support in terms of infrastructure and encouragement around being able to assist communities to implement great community-driven solutions. Now, we've seen this in places like Fitzroy Crossing, you know, a place that I called home for many years in my life, Deputy Speaker. You know, some of the most amazing, predominantly women I have known, very strong Bunurba women who led, and not just Bunurba women, but who led really brave and courageous changes in their community to deal with the issue around alcohol, the impact that that was having for kids in their community in particular. They have managed to turn around a situation without, blaming particular persons or victimising, without socially isolating parts of their communities. They have engendered great community buy-in to the solutions in their town that are going to work to help turn around that alcohol addictions in Fitzroy Crossing. There's much evidence, and that story is now well documented. I say this House should be supporting those kinds of community-driven approaches and pathways that assist communities to empower their own peoples. They, in fact, know much better than most in this House what will work in those communities. Regretfully, what we have before us in this House is as I said, a very narrowly focused piece of legislation that purports to being a temporary measure, but we've seen what temporary measures are like in this House. They have a terrible habit of, decades going by and those temporary measures becoming permanent impositions in communities, chipping away slowly by slowly any efforts at self-management, any efforts to restore autonomy into families and community lives. We do people no favours when we disempower them. We do communities no favours when we do not support their own community-driven solutions and approaches. It is a great disappointment that we appear not to be learning from important lessons learned, shown to us in the past. If there was terrific community support backing in these proposals, if there was a body of strong evidence demonstrating the effectiveness of these proposals, then that would be a different conversation for this House. There have been many alternative approaches put before the Senate inquiry. Regretfully, we're not exploring those in this House. We're not looking at different ways that you might look at the, increasing taxation on alcohol to assist with those.
The member's time
again,
has
a
expired.
narrowly focused.